Thank you very much for the introduction and for being here. This is quite a big topic to talk about in 15 minutes, so I'm going to do my best. And what I'm going to do is put the challenge slightly through the lens of cities, as most of us live in cities. So I'm going to be looking at, particularly at the crossover between more people, but also the stress points and cities as a key part of this. And trying to look at maybe some of the challenges, but also some of the opportunities. Where the views that I'm sharing are coming from is basically conversations with lots of people, such as yourselves around the world. Over the past few years, we've talked to about 10,000 people in 60 different cities on everything from the future of energy and future of cities to future of privacy, future of data. So my job is to sort of play back what everybody's thinking. Because around the world, people are trying to deal with these challenges in different ways. And I suppose one perspective that we're trying to do is just sort of play back and say, well, just maybe start looking at the world through a slightly different lens. So this is basically the world if you resized each country by population in 2020. So fundamentally, that's where the people are, which tends to tie in with some positive news. If you're Australian or Canadian, you get slightly annoyed by that map. But generally, that's where the people are, and so presumably that's where all the activity is going to have to be focused. So if we look a little bit at the sort of what people are saying, the big problems, and then move on to the solutions. First up, when you talk to people about population, they're not really worried about another 3 billion. We're relatively relaxed that we can accommodate 3 billion if only they were in the right places and they were the right ages. So the problem that we've got is that, A, we're largely in the wrong places, and secondly, although we've done a great job of improving healthcare, so we're all now living to 80 to 90 to 100, the demographics in lots of countries are really against us. So obviously people think about China and Japan, Singapore, everywhere you've got low birth rates, but the same is true in France, in Italy, and lots of countries are going to have the same demographic problem of not enough babies, lots of old people, so how does that all balance out? Added to that, we're increasingly living in cities. 50% of us a few years ago, heading towards 70%, and we all want to be in cities. That's where opportunity is, that's where all the interesting stuff happens. So places like Sao Paulo are just growing and growing. Now, the challenge for quite a few places is that there's no master plan. Singapore's probably one of the few cities in the world that's got a plan that sort of says, okay, this is how we're going to accommodate more people over the next 10, 20 years. You go to places, particularly in the Middle East, but in China and in India, and they're growing so quickly, but there is no plan. And that is creating intense stress points at certain areas. So one of the most obvious that people always talk about are the townships and favelas that you see dotted around the world. You talk to the UN, they reckon around about a third of the world's urban population is currently living in unplanned parts of cities. So they may have mobile connection, but they don't have fresh water. There's no actual planned infrastructure. So that's starting to increase tension even more. And then you get the inequality issue really coming to the fore. You've got places like Johannesburg, which is always cited as one of the most unequal cities in the world, where the rich and the poor are pretty close together. But there's other places where the rich and the poor are really, really close together. And your question is, as more people move into cities, as there's more of us, how do we manage the inequality side of things? Because you're starting to see tension. You're starting to see, in different parts of the world, people are pushing back. You go to Istanbul a couple of years ago, there was protests about public parks being taken over for development. Go to Spain a couple of years ago, protests about unemployment. Lots of issues are starting to add tension to what is happening as a natural progression anyway. And perhaps the one that's most politically sensitive and rises, particularly in this current climate, most ill-informed comment is that of migration. We're increasingly facing the reality that migration is a positive thing. It's the natural way we solve the problem of the wrong people in the wrong places. but we're increasingly becoming more nationalistic and trying to stop the migration happening. And that, whether it's in China, whether it's in the States, whether it's in Europe, it's causing tensions, which is adding on to the problem of more of us living in cities. Now, if that's now, and you ask people, so what's it going to be like in the future? Talk to the people around projecting climate change impact, and the story gets really quite spooky. So most people in the climate change world now feel that 2 degrees of warming, we've missed that. 3 degrees, we're pretty much past that. We're probably going to end up somewhere between 4 and 5 degrees, which is an abstract thought. What does 4 or 5 degrees mean? If you talk to those scientists and say, so just tell me from a impact on the world, more drought, more flooding, etc. One of the things they say is that there'll be 1 billion people moving this century, most of them moving north. Now, at the moment, we're dealing with around about 5 million people moving a year. But when we start to scale up to billions, if you look at all the problems that Europe had a couple of years ago about trying to stop 1 million people arriving, what happens when it's 50 million people arriving? So again, it's becoming more and more of a layer on layer on layer problem. We do get some good news in a few minutes in case anybody's worried. So they are increasingly going into cities. Those cities are increasingly unprepared for them. We're getting more and more problems of dirty water, pollution, unhealthy environments. On top of that, climate change is coming along, and we've got more hurricanes, more, as they like to call it in Texas, weird weather. It's happening more and more often, whether it's New York or anywhere else. We're going to have to get used to this. And the insurance companies are no longer reinsuring New York. They're no longer reinsuring Miami. So the liability is starting to really fall on the leaders of those cities to say, okay, how can we become, and the current big word for it is resilient. How do we get ready to cope with all this? We've got all the people moving, but then we've got all the climate change and all that stuff. And we're going to see more cities having to deal with flooding. Now, unfortunately, 80% of all our cities are on the coast. It's a reality, but none of them are really designed to float. So we've got to deal with this reality that we're living in cities that aren't prepared for the future. So how do we mitigate that? If you talk to some people, there are plans to relocate parts of New York, relocate parts of Miami, etc. But are there plans to relocate parts of Mumbai, Jakarta, Bangkok? Probably not. So we've got these real structural challenges happening at the same time as population. We've got air quality, increasingly anxious thoughts. We've got water stress. And going back to what was the title of the talk, we've got food problems. We throw 1/3 of our food away every day. So there's an immediate answer there. If we want to feed another 3 billion, just don't waste the food. We don't need more food. We just need to stop wasting it. But that's easier said than done, largely because lots of us aren't really thinking about the long term and how it all joins together. You know, there are places that have plans, but there's lots of locations where we are still, metaphorically and physically, got our heads in the sand. So as we talk to people, what are they saying are the answers? What are they saying are the fixes that we can put together to make all this work? First up, let's solve that food problem. Let's get rid of the ridiculous things like use-by dates and things like that. Let's change consumer behavior about throwing away food, and let's fix supply chain problems. Let's fundamentally change our attitude to cows. Cows take over more land than humans do. Everyone keeps on citing, a kilogram of beef takes 2,000 liters of water. It's the most inefficient food on the planet, and yet we all keep on eating more of it. So let's stop doing that. Let's start not necessarily all becoming vegetarian, but let's shift to chickens and pork, because that's far more efficient use of resources than, for some reason, our obsession with beef. As was highlighted yesterday, there's lots of technology coming along to improve the way we grow rice, we grow grain, drought-resistant, salt-resistant. There's lots of great technology now coming into the world through the big companies, but also some of the small ones who are really getting the yield per acre massively higher. And there's a lot of interest in food from the water. There are places in the world that are overfished, but the whole blue food, aquaculture, is a huge area of potential interest. In terms of cities themselves, people increasingly talk about dense cities, but they also want livable cities. And sort of the poster child for that is Paris. It's got more people per square meter than a lot of other cities, but it does it in a way that it's a nice place to live. So Hong Kong and Paris are the sort of the models that people aspire to, rather than LA, Mexico City, and places where there's a huge urban sprawl. There's huge opportunity from an energy point of view to try and effectively solve all these problems anyway. There's some people who are very convinced that the answer to all our energy needs is solar. Whether we get there in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, or 40 years depends upon which technology you're talking about. But if the answer to the energy problem globally is solar, and cities want to be more energy secure as well as food secure, if we can solve food, energy storage and energy distribution, then we can get that energy to where it needs to be, and then we start to have really interesting opportunities. Because if we can get nearly free energy, then potentially, with the right desalination plants, we can get nearly free water. And if we've got nearly free water, then we've got nearly free food. So potentially, if we can join together these different elements, the energy production, the energy distribution, the desalination, and start to grow the food that we actually ought to be eating where we want to eat it and not in the wrong places, then you start to bring together some interesting opportunities. At the same time, don't forget the demographics. We've also got to change our views on how we work, how we live. Aging is one of those issues that lots of cities are now got sort of chief aging officers, they're trying to deal with it. The reality is we can't work for 30 years and retire for 40. Most of us have come from places that your retirement was designed to be 10. If you talk to actuaries, they talk about retirement happens at death minus 10. We can't go for 30, 40 years, so therefore we need to work till we're 70. So lots of governments are talking about changing retirement age to 70, 75 over the next few years. And that's a fundamental cultural change as well as structural. And then perhaps most significantly in all of this is the role of education. If we want to address some of these big problems, then yes, we've got health problems, we've got food problems, we've got energy problems, but if we can put better information, better insight into the hands of everybody, so whether it's by digital schools, whether it's classrooms in the cloud, if we can empower people to actually see the opportunities, then, so the argument goes, everything else hopefully comes through. So the last thing really I just want to sort of share is where people are placing their bets. In all this, it's really interconnected. It's really, the individual items are quite simple to understand, but it's the interplay that's a challenge. And most countries have now almost like ceded responsibility to cities. Cities are where we live. Cities are where interesting stuff happens. Cities are where the problems are going to be. So it's going to be cities and organizations like the C40 and the C100 and the Resilient 100 cities who are going to be the ones that come up with the solutions. They're going to be the ones that share best practice. And just like you've had things like congestion charge and no smoking, and you get having fat tax at the moment, moving city to city to city, just like bicycle rental started in Paris and then went from Paris to Marrakesh, to Hungary, to London, to New York. The best ideas are moving city to city. And so the answer seems to be in all of this, if we know what the problems are, we can see where the challenges are really emerging, then if we're going to address the problem, it's probably down to the cities to collaborate and share insights around that. And lastly, if we're going to be able to deal with this extra 3 billion, most of them in cities, then let's rethink maybe what the role of a city environment actually is, because that's where everything's going to be focused. Thank you.